Week 10, everyone. Thanks again for your hard work this past week, your insights into some challenging texts, not the least of which is 1 Timothy 2. I hope that by this point in the course, you're beginning to see why careful attention to New Testament texts is crucial to the way that we negotiate our theological and social inheritance, as well as the way that we try to gently promote healthy and faithful ways forward in our Christian communities. I want to devote most of this intro video to some general comments about interpretive working papers. You've all received your first interpretive working paper back from me with comments on it, and as you're preparing your second interpretive working paper this week, a draft of which you'll be submitting to your partner that's assigned for this second working paper, I want you to try to bear in mind some of the guidance that I want to give here with respect to 5 issues in particular. 5 issues. So the first one is how you set up your passage in an interpretive working paper, but this would have relevance for how you would set up a passage in a sermon or other contexts as well. It's clear that the class has taught you to be attentive to the context of the passage. That's probably something you're already aware of before you came to the class, but I'm glad to see that in your papers you're spending some time trying to set up your consideration of the key passage by situating it in its context. Now, you've done that in a narrative, and you're now going to be doing it in the second paper in a letter. The challenge, however, is how to do that. And something that I think we could afford to work on as a class is the following. When you begin to trace the development of the book before coming to your passage, and you start going through the, say, the preceding passage, for example, instead of simply kind of giving a blow-by-blow of what happened in the previous passage, you want to highlight what it is about the previous passage that relates in a constructive and important way to the meaning of a particular part of your passage or the whole of your passage. So don't just give a kind of blow-by-blow of what happens right before your passage in the book that you're studying, but instead highlight the features of the previous passage or the preceding context that bear directly on what you are going to be presenting in your study of your passage. So you'll notice that I've made some comments to that effect in your papers, many of them, and I just wanted to clarify that now in this video for everyone. Second issue is, as you are presenting your analysis of the passage, I would highly recommend organizing your presentation into the stages of a passage. In other words, your passage has a kind of progress of development, and that comes in chunks or stages. And those stages are not usually mere verses or sentences. They're larger units of text. If you don't present your text in stages, then you will often find yourself diving into the study of a key word or an ambiguous phrase that is in fact clarified to some extent by the way that the passage continues in the next few sentences in that same stage of the argument. And so you don't really want to dive into questioning or analyzing a particular part of a stage of the text without taking into account the whole stage of which it is a part. So by organizing your paper in stages, you'll be in a better position to analyze the particular parts that are ambiguous or need clarification in your interpretive study. You'll be able to come at those with a sense of how they unfold over the course of that stage of the passage, and even over the course of the passage as a whole. And then that will help you avoid asking questions that the text itself kind of gives a relatively straightforward or plain answer to, and to ask better questions that are taking into account what the passage goes on to say with the key term or phrase that you're analyzing, and then subjects that key term or phrase to some questioning in light of how it is developed in the whole of that stage of the passage or the whole of the passage. So you'll just have, I think, a more kind of mindful take on a particular phrase or word that you're studying if you present it as part of a particular stage of the passage. So that's number 2. Number 3, remember that you are, in these papers, working at the interpretation of a particular text that is in front of you in English. So when you're reading a text about a particular scene in Jesus' life, or a particular scene in the book of Acts, as some of you did, your task is not to interpret sort of what this means in the whole of Jesus' life, so that then you find yourself trying to fill in the gaps of your passage with what other passages in the Gospels say about Jesus' life that seems to be relevant to what's happening in your passage. The difficulty with that is that you're finding yourself imagining that this text is sort of trying to give you a final presentation of Jesus, and since it lacks a bunch of things, you have to add them in to fill in the gaps. But that's not actually what texts in the New Testament do. The texts of the New Testament, sticking with the Gospels here for a moment, and then we're going to apply it to the letters, they are quite aware that they have been highly selective, that they don't mean to give you a complete picture of Jesus' life. The end of John's Gospel says that all of the books of the world could not do that. So the purpose then of interpretation is to really hone in on what this particular text in front of you is saying. What is it communicating? What is its message? Not what do we learn about Jesus' life from this passage if we mix it with a bunch of other passages that seem to fill in the gaps. I hope you can see the difference between those two ways of using the Bible, and what I want you to focus on in this class is interpreting the text that you have in front of you. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't look at other texts, but the purpose of looking at parallel passages is not to fill in gaps. It's actually to sharpen your focus on the text that is already in front of you, so that if they say something a little bit different, it might bring into bolder relief what you have in front of you in the text that you're studying. But it won't be a matter of filling in a gap that you can then add as if that kind of completes what was lacking about your passage. When it comes to letters, you're going to be tempted to do this because the letters also deal with big theological questions. And so when there's a certain kind of ambiguity that arises in your mind as you're studying the passage, your impulse sometimes is going to be to go to another passage of the Bible where that same general idea is discussed, and to grab a hold of something there, and then to use that to say, see, so this is what it means here in the passage that I am studying in Paul's letter to the Galatians, or in 1 Peter, or whatever it is. The problem with that is that's not typically going to be a careful analysis, an interpretive analysis of the particular passage that you're studying. That's going to use your passage as simply one witness among many to a general idea that you want to clarify. And that's not the same sort of task. So do your best to focus your paper on interpreting the passage that you have in front of you. Not trying to gain clarity about the general ideas that it seems to bring up, but trying to gain clarity about what this particular passage is saying. That's going to be important, especially with Paul's letters, because, of course, some of what Paul writes in one letter, he discusses in parallel fashion in another letter. If you choose, and I'm not sure you should, but if you choose to go to that parallel passage, say you're doing something in Ephesians, and it's Ephesians 2, and you know that there's something very similar that seems to be said about the law in Galatians, then when you go and find something in Galatians that's you think is helping your study of Ephesians, you have to come back to Ephesians and then say, okay, how does what we just looked at in Galatians sharpen our focus on what these words in Ephesians 2 are saying in this particular place? At the end of the day, your task is to conduct an interpretive study of that passage in Ephesians 2, not of the general ideas that it raises that happen to come up in Ephesians and in Galatians and in Romans and a little bit in 1 Corinthians and a bunch of other things. You can see that what happens is, at the end of the day, we're not really reading passages very closely. We're just kind of sifting them for what they contribute to what we want to know theologically about a certain general idea. And I don't think that our knowledge of the New Testament will be as good if that's how we read it, nor frankly will our theology be very sophisticated, because what we will do is just use diverse passages to confirm one general idea that we're committed to, as opposed to allowing the diverse witnesses of the New Testament to speak with all of their particularity, so that the theological reasoning that we might have as a result will be nourished by all of that richness of each of those witnesses in conversation with one another, rather than chopping them all down to the size of one general idea. So I'm trying to help you here with textual interpretation, but as a function of what I take to be a healthier and more sophisticated way of reasoning theologically about life, etc. That's point 3. Point 4, and this kind of goes in line with what I've already been saying. Many of you, because you are acutely aware of how your passage is but a small part of the larger book or section that you're studying, have tended to devote a good deal of your paper to the bigger picture, to what surrounds your passage. And on the one hand, that might be a helpful corrective, because it's better than just sort of parachuting into your passage and ignoring everything around it. That won't work. But I think the pendulum might have swung a little bit too far in the other direction for some of you, where your paper, when I get to the end of it, has not really engaged in a careful analysis of the internal development of the passage. So whatever you're saying about the surrounding context of your passage, as important as that is, you want it to be helping you engage in a careful interpretive study in stages, as I said before, of the internal development of the passage under study. So make sure that you're not sort of giving short shrift or inadequate attention to how your particular passage unfolds on the inside of it in all of its detail. That really is what should occupy the bulk of the analysis of your interpretive working paper. Fifth issue. I appreciate that many of you are sort of cultivating this approach to study where you're asking questions of the text. Others of you are still working on that, and you'll have gotten feedback from me to that effect. What I want us to work on now in this second working paper is enhancing the quality of the questions that we ask of the text. Sometimes, because these texts deal with such huge questions, huge theological questions, the questions you're moved to include in your paper are simply the general theological questions that are raised for you by the passage. And sometimes those can be very speculative and, frankly, don't really help you study the passage any better, partly because nothing about studying the passage itself will help you address that question. So, as you're formulating your questions in the course of your study, ask yourself, is this question helping point me back at the text, drawing me more deeply into it, helping me to see details perhaps in a new light that I hadn't seen? Or is this question sending me far afield so that I'm not really thinking about what this text says in detail anymore? I'm just wondering broadly about a question that this text has triggered in my mind. So hopefully you see the difference. Along the same lines, questions for which the answer is simply a yes or a no are not typically questions that are going to generate a lot of insight for you as you study. Because what you're looking for are questions that are not easily answered with a yes or no, but that help you probe what this text is saying, how the argument progresses, what is at stake in it, what its rhetorical force is, what its thrust or message is, why two sort of apparently contradictory ideas are mashed together in the text as if they made sense together. Asking those kinds of questions is what's going to help you get at what the text is saying. Whereas if you ask a kind of flat question, the answer to which is just yes or no, it's not really deepening your study or analysis of the passage. So when you ask a question in your paper, ask yourself, is the answer to this question a simple yes or no? If so, reformulate that question and try to make it a little sharper, something that asks for a little bit more, a little more nuance, a little more substance. And then when you ask good questions, what you want to do in your paper is then you want to continue another few steps of reasoning interpretively with the text, trying to understand what it says in the light of that question that you've asked, so that that question is in a sense what's creating space for your analysis of the passage, sort of opening up the possibility to consider possibilities that you might not have considered if you hadn't asked the question and then paused with the text sort of in the wake of that question. So hopefully these ways of kind of taking the next step here in your working papers are going to help you improve your interpretive skill as we move from interpretive working paper 1 now to interpretive working paper 2. I'm looking forward to what you come up with, and of course during the week we'll be focusing our New Testament study on the two books of 1 Peter and James. And I've got some exercises for you to do with those that I hope is going to give you some approaches to textual study that will help you not only in these books, but that you can use in the study of other books in the New Testament as well. And because your plate is full, as I know, because it's week 10, and because you've got a draft of your second working paper coming due here this week, there's only going to be one response forum. So that will be a lot to fit into one forum. I'll try to make sure the prompt is giving you enough focus so that we can have a meaningful discussion in there. But I look forward to what your reactions are to the material this week. And if my discussion of these 5 issues for working papers has left you confused about something, especially as you're working on your second working paper, please don't hesitate to email me. We can try to arrange a telephone call if necessary as well. I'm going to be out of the country starting Thursday, but even so, I should be relatively accessible by email and should be able to arrange a phone call if need be. It might help you to try to reach me before Thursday if you want to get a quick response from me that would clarify something about these 5 issues that I've raised. Thanks again for your hard work. Looking forward to the interaction with you this week.